When brands look for new markets, an obvious choice for many is Western Europe, where consumers have strong buying power, there's grade A retail property, and market entry can be less baffling compared with tackling emerging markets. Yet while many brands have successfully entered the European market, just as many, even well-established brands, have failed. That's left companies wondering whether they should try to build a retail presence in Europe, and if so, how to do it. I'm Jane Singer, and welcome back to A Seat at the Table, where each week we get to hear from industry leaders and innovators who share their ideas, outlook, and experience so that we can build stronger and more successful businesses. Today we're joined by Chris Igwe, a top advisor to retailers who are looking to expand into Europe. In his early career, Chris was head of real estate Europe for Foot Locker and then Gap before joining ICSC, that's the International Council of Shopping Centers, as Managing Director Europe. Today he advises global retailers and brands on retail real estate from strategy to implementation across the EMEA region. Chris has worked with many brands including Seven for All Mankind, Build-A-Bear Workshop, Nike, Michael Kors, and others, as well as owners and investors such as Euro Disney, Value Retail, Deutsche Bank, and many more. Today he joins us here on A Seat at the Table to talk about the current opportunities in the European market and how to successfully enter this market. In particular, Chris will be discussing key opportunities he sees in the European market right now, blind spots in brand strategy that cause them to fail in the European market, what the future of European retail could look like, and how foreign brands can build strong teams in Europe. A strong team is the foundation of most successful businesses. However, finding the right people can be challenging, especially in international markets. That's why leading brands look to AsiaNet consultants to help them identify and recruit the right talent in key global markets. AsiaNet has the advantage of decades of experience, a strong network, and a solid reputation for being able to fill even difficult search assignments. To learn more, take a look at their website at asianetconsultants.com. I'll also leave a link for this in the show notes of this episode. Meanwhile, let's sit down with Chris and find out about opportunities in Europe's retail market. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us here on A Seat at the Table. I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say about the retail sector in Europe. We haven't had much conversation about that recently, and I think that between Europe and certainly in the Middle East and parts of Africa as well, there's a lot of developments that are going on post-pandemic that I believe people would be very interested to hear about.
Well, first of all, Jane, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it, and I'd be more than happy to share what I know about the retail market. I have to say I am based in Paris, and therefore from my own vantage point, having lived here in France for about 27, 28 years, but lived in other European countries as well. So I do have, through my past clients, equally a vision of what has happened and where we are today. So happy to share.
Yeah, that's perfect. Looking at the European market, what are some of the key things that you see happening around the retail property market right now, or around retail in general?
Well, I think if we just pick up on the e-commerce part, and I know it's been a global phenomenon to the extent that obviously certain sectors, in particular food, supermarkets, clearly benefited from that. Outdoor did as well, in terms of people saying, okay, I want to not only go in physically, but I want to buy as much online, and therefore increase especially because in Europe in general, and France in particular, lockdown was taken very seriously. So you were actually sanctioned in France, for example. We had fines. I think it was 125 euros, which is about $150, I guess. If you were in contravention, there was a whole list of reasons you were allowed to leave your home. And if you carried on, next time it was doubled. And then if you continued, the fine was up to 1,000 something. So we were very serious about the implementation of that, which then encouraged the online purchasing, of course, taking place. Now, the reason I raise that is not because it's necessarily unique to France, although we're more stringent than, say, the UK or the US was, especially certain states within the US. So we had to take it seriously, which meant once people were able to then get out of their houses and their small apartments in Paris and other major cities, there was a great desire to get back into stores. So I say that because it was almost like there was a push, a need to get back out into physical. Once they were into physical, the expectations, however, were higher and still remain high. In other words, if I go into a store, I want to have the service. I wouldn't say best possible service, although you're moving towards that, but you want service of a certain quality for you to have come back into the store. So service needs to be there. Obviously, product needs to be there, and just the environment within which you shop needs to be there as well. So those factors all grouped together, yes, meant that physical retail has been back and is back. Now, I think we need to differentiate between the retailers and brands and the shopping center owners, retail parks, and so on. Outlets was very different. So designer outlets already through the pandemic, because it's open space and so on, they didn't see too much of a fall off except in certain sectors, segments of the industry. So the point there is, firstly, shopping centers, so developments overall, new developments, there were not many. So there have been some that have been carried on and opened up, and therefore physical retail in high streets and shopping centers existing needed to be more attractive. So overall, what I'm saying is there's been a human desire to get back into physical retail. However, the demand and expectation of quality and service is higher, which is why, and we may talk about it, that kind of mid-market fashion has struggled perhaps faster and hit the wall much quicker than they might have expected.
I think that's a really good point, because I think people tremendously overlook how much consumers value quality, and service, of course, is part of that, the quality of the product, the design quality, and so forth. And I think that people oftentimes just look at fast fashion, and particularly at the very ultra cheap end of fast fashion, and simply think that that's the only thing that consumers want. So I think it's interesting that you brought that up. When you're looking at brands that are coming into the EU market, because certainly now a lot of international brands are looking to become more international, so to speak. People are looking for new markets. It's becoming increasingly difficult to grow in some of the existing key markets. What do you think brands are getting wrong when they enter the EU market? Where are the blind spots in their strategy?
Oh my goodness, Jane, that's a whole podcast in itself, trust me. After all the years of experience that I've had, I started out, first of all, at Foot Locker. So I was head of real estate. My first 10 years was in the construction industry, civil engineer, that's my background, and worked on some major international projects, from Stansted Airport, which is London's third airport, to the famed MI6 building, which is featured in James Bond. So that whole green glass and facade was my team when I was based in Switzerland. So I moved out of civil engineering into retail. And I knew absolutely nothing about retail. It's a long story as to how I got into retail, but that's not the point for just now. I then was involved with Foot Locker across the 8 markets and 220 or so stores we had at the time, which allowed me to learn very fast, because I didn't know about retail. I knew even less about retail real estate, and I knew even less about markets, from the UK to Italy to we were in the Netherlands, which is where the headquarters were based, down to Portugal. So complex, but it allowed me to learn fast. Having gone from Foot Locker, I then went to Gap, head of real estate for Gap in Europe, and did the same thing. And then I went into consulting, my own business. I bring all that in because if you are focused as a retailer or brand on one market, and let's be honest, the first market that most Anglo-Saxon players, the US in particular, and Asia to a degree, they look at the UK and they think, well, it's English speaking, must be similar, must be the same as, and it isn't. So it's really important to understand that each market, and of course, when I was advising brands and they were saying, I want to be in the UK, I'm going, well, the UK is like anywhere else. London is very different from Birmingham to Manchester to Glasgow and Edinburgh in the north, as it is from Paris to Bordeaux, for example. So coming in with this notion of everywhere is the same is the biggest fault, I would say. And to be honest, it's not so much about understanding the real estate or the retail market. It's the level of arrogance that retailers or brands come into a market with. That kind of, I know it all. I've seen it all. And if you're talking to a CEO, and I've had the pleasure of dealing over the years with many CEOs, and one in particular I won't name, but major CEO out of the US, and he would say to me, Chris, I know my brand better than you do. So this is where I want to be. And I would challenge him, because I have no issue about challenging, especially if, although they weren't formally a client at that stage, but the wrong advice to me is the worst thing that one can do for a client, or even if they don't become a client. It's really saying, okay, let me just explain the market to you and show you how it is. So if we, within that context of arrogance and ego, if we can get beneath all that, then we can then start to look at things that I imagine that you'd be thinking about, Jane, which are lease contracts, lease terms. How does a lease get structured? What are the key pitfalls that may happen? What are the main high streets and shopping centers that need to be looked at? So as you build all these things in, it helps understand what the market is like. But there's nothing that can replace the attitude and behavior of individuals within that market to a new brand coming in. So, for example, in Italy or in France, there's a very different approach to doing deals than there is in the UK or indeed in Germany. So those are just a few of the things. There's the kind of structural aspect of how the industry or the sector is constructed within the market, but it's more important about how the brand coming in wants to impose their will, as it were, on the market. And that is where they fail. You cannot impose your will on a market that you do not understand.
That is such a good point, Chris. And as someone who's lived overseas myself, you can definitely see that. You can see that the brands that succeed in getting into these markets, as you're saying, understand the market and try to come in as, I don't know if you'd call it a good citizen. That's probably not the right wording for it, but come in and with a little bit of humility. And the other ones, as you're saying, that come in with this bullying approach, in a sense that I know everything. I'm a big deal in my home market, so therefore I'm a big deal everywhere, have not been quite as successful. So I'm really happy that you've explained that and been able to share that point of view.
And it's a very human aspect, Jane, to be at the end of the day, you're dealing with human beings. You might be the head of real estate, or you might be the CEO of a company, and it's your perception, your positioning of what your intentions are to be a hero in your company, let's say, which I always say to my potential or future clients, and this is a phrase I've used time and time again, what do you need to do to be a hero in your company? Because I can help you do that, but we've got to get aligned. If I know what that is, I can then help you become that hero, because I don't need to impress anybody. Certainly after my 30 odd years experience in the industry, I don't believe there's anyone I need to prove anything to. And that's not arrogance. That is just feet on the ground, because I've worked with some of the best and greatest brands and I've helped them to succeed. Those that haven't, we've taken them out of market and moved on. So it's less about me as an advisor today. It's about your expectations and wishes and how I can help you to get there. And then we'll build a plan together.
I think that's really a good way to look at it. You're right. Everyone has to be, in a sense, first and foremost, a hero to their own company, right? And so often it's difficult to parse that with being able to do the right thing for each market that you come into, and try to explain that back up the chain to management, who might not understand that. We maybe have to come in a little bit more modest way and then build from there. So I think it's an interesting point, and you're right. I have seen that with brands. If you are coming into Europe at the moment, what do you see as some of the key opportunities right now? I mean, it's a huge market, and as you pointed out, you can't really lump Europe together as if it's one country. But if you are looking at the region, do you see areas of opportunity?
We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
Yes, there are. And sadly or not, depending on how one looks at it, the pandemic has created pockets or situations where major high streets in certain dominant shopping centers or strong performing shopping centers owned by the major owners that I'm sure you're familiar with, there are opportunities. Now, opportunities are one thing, but then it doesn't necessarily mean that your choices are going to be simpler. So, for example, you have to decide whether it's a London, a Paris, a Milan, or a Munich, which is decided within the context of your brand and what your brand is choosing to offer, where your consumer is, where maybe there are some white spots in terms of your strategy. Maybe you're already in Europe, or maybe you're coming into Europe. So it's really important to stop and say, where should I go, first of all, and then how should I get there? But opportunities there are, absolutely, all sizes, all ranges. But it doesn't mean, and this is also a very important point, it does not mean that the landlords are any more tender than they were pre-pandemic. Now, the opportunity may be for a new brand coming in and they're thinking, wow, that's a nice, cool, very attractive brand. I will make an effort. But the effort that the landlord is making is not necessarily the one that the brand may think, gosh, that's still, I've done my homework and, you know, it's 100%, but you're saying you'll give it to me for 80% rent. That's not a gift. You're not really helping. So okay, we just have to be careful that we don't expect more than is possible and available. But the good news is, yes, there are opportunities in Europe, in the major high streets. They just have to be looked at carefully to decide which ones and what sizes and so on suit.
Right. Now, do you see any markets or subsets of markets right now that look to you as having particular unique opportunities for international brands to come into?
Yes, I mean, the first is, and a new brand coming into the market anyway, an advisor like me would be not doing our job properly if we suggested that they go to an A- category location, for example. I think that if you come into a new market, I know if you come into a new market, you've got to be in a prime environment, prime section of a mall, prime section of a high street. Trying to go off market, and I say that because it does happen, because in certain markets, even today, it may be that the rental value of that location is not what a brand can sustain based on their own internal economics. But I've seen it time and time again where they've gone a little bit off pitch to save money and discovered that the customer doesn't follow them. No matter how good or big a brand they are, they don't do it. So my recommendation is always go for prime. Once you go for prime and you test out and see what happens, you can then decide on the rest of your the evolution of your brand. So where are the kind of the micro markets? The main, I would say, is simply you've got to stay on prime as a new brand coming in. If you're not in the market at all, whether it's in a certain country, so you might be, let's say, already from the US or from Asia in the UK or in France, and you want to go to another market, always go for prime. You minimize the risks, first of all. In terms of sectors and segments, it's clear that in most markets, for better or for worse, a new brand coming in has to be more premium to luxury. Those are the ones that are being highly sought after, I would say, and possibly lesser risk of failure, but certainly more attractive to the client, to the landlord. And then the other end of the spectrum are value retailers, let's put it that way. Not necessarily, I'm not talking about taking 20,000 square feet or 40 or whatever. It could be 2,000 square feet, could be even less, but you position yourself at the value end. Those are the two sections, I would say, in the industry overall, where there are opportunities. Inevitably, the mass market positioning is still challenged, but it can work and does work if you come with a unique offer. So as a retailer, because they're possibly less likely to be a brand, they come in and they have a unique offer. Maybe it's a concept store, as we call them, or multi-brand store, of which there are fewer and fewer across Europe. Whereas I believe in the US, you still have quite a few multi-brand stores. So if you come in with a new concept that's unique in whatever segment, could be accessories, it could be home furnishing, that is also an opportunity for new retailers coming into the market.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up multi-brand, because we had seen a lot of multi-brand back in the day, and then that sort of gave way to concept stores where every brand wanted to have their own store. And then people started to realize that it's difficult to have your own store, not just a few flagships, but to have so many, and that maybe being part of a multi-brand might be another way to have visibility and be able to reach more people without having to carry the whole burden yourself. Do you see multi-brand as something that has a lot of room for growth, or do you feel it's still going to be fairly contained for the time being?
No, I think it's the latter. I think it's going to be contained. I think it's quite difficult because the mix of the merchandise, and obviously, I know that you mentioned that, inside fashion is very much around the supply chain. So the challenge around bringing in different kinds of products within a space, I think could lead, it's more of a headache today. That it shouldn't be, but I think it's more of a headache for various different reasons. Sourcing, where is it coming from? What is the sustainability? There's a whole mix of things where retail is complex enough today, more so than it used to be. And then when you've got more moving parts within a space, I think it's quite difficult to do. But then also it's a question of how big you make your space. I think some of the bigger concept stores or multi-brand stores have been able to, there it's not about number of stores, it's about having a few stores and doing them really well. So that's where they focus their time, their energy, their resources, their staffing on almost sort of best in class within those one or two locations they might have. So I think there's a place for it, but I don't see a lot of entrepreneurs, let's put it that way, or indeed retailers or brands rushing towards that for the moment.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point about the complexity of it at a time when everyone is trying to remove complexity as much as possible from the picture. Now, I noticed that in Europe, at least before the pandemic, there seemed to be more growth of what you'd call, at least in the US, we call outlets, which tend to be off price, and even malls in general. What do you see happening around that in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, that's the sector that has been very resilient, to be honest, and for the same reasons in the US. Although in the US, you've got a much more mature portfolio, much more mature market. And at the same time, in terms of the owner-operators of those centers, I think it's more around how do you renovate and make them more attractive to your consumer, because otherwise they get bored. There's just not, you can't go to the same outlet all the time and expect beyond the merchandise and product which changes. In Europe, we've seen a continued steady growth of outlets, whether it's from the UK into Russia, for example, or indeed into Scandinavia and down into Portugal. So we've continued to see strategic growth, I would say, in terms of the portfolios that the various companies have. But the sector itself has been resilient, as I said, because they exist outdoors anyway. So not that, for example, in France, you could necessarily rush out to an outlet, because unless you were going out during the pandemic for the reasons I mentioned, you've got to have a reason for going shopping. And generally you had to go shopping for primary and essential products. But as things started to ease up or were slightly less challenging, being outdoors meant that the COVID restrictions of masks, which again, we were very serious with in France, social distancing, etc., was easier, but people wanted to go out. So the industry overall performed well and performed much better than full price. But then within those, there were certain sectors that performed less, for example. So because we were all in our Lululemon outfits or whatever brand you like, you didn't need to go and buy a suit and tie and shoes and heels and goodness knows what else. So that, you know, that sector was impacted, travel was impacted. So within the overall scheme of outlets, there were certain sectors that didn't perform as well. But overall, yes, they were flying the flag for the industry, and continue to do so, by the way, because there are still some outlets that are being developed, especially in Central Eastern Europe, and we've just had one open here in the west of the Paris region, which I've not had the chance to see, opened by MacArthur Glen, and I think that was a 15 or 16-year challenge to get it open. So I'm looking forward to seeing that one.
So in other words, you would say that, despite, you know, factoring out the success of these outlet malls during the pandemic, the future you feel is quite strong for them as a retail sector?
Yes, it is. Yeah, absolutely. I have the privilege of knowing, at least in Europe, and a couple of people in the US, the outlet industry, and I've been involved with hosting for quite a few years. You probably know MAPIC, the annual event in Cannes, of which I'm master of ceremony, and we each year have a closed door outlet section, which I'm privileged to be able to host. So a lot of my friends are in that industry and in that sector at CEO level. So yes, they're very bullish about where the industry is going in the future.
Yeah, so interesting, because initially that was a very American type of a concept, right? And now we've seen it spread, of course, more so in Asia and in Europe as well. Was a bit, I don't want to say unexpected in Europe, but it wasn't what people would have guessed, I suppose.
No, but I guess like everybody, we're always looking for getting the best price for a designer label or brand, and if these great operators can do it, then that's the place to be. So yeah, that's almost where you fulfill the desire of the consumer in general today. I mean, there are those who'll obviously go to the Louis Vuitton, for example, on the Champs-Elysees, and there's always queues there. I don't really understand it, but there's always a queue, which is fantastic. So you'll always get those who will never shop anywhere but at full price in a luxury environment, which is great. But then there are those who are wanting to have that luxury, and the easiest access point is through these outlets, assuming the outlets are positioned obviously in a premium to luxury end.
So then, from your perspective, what does the future of European retail look like?
Well, the good news is overall, without sounding blasé, it looks strong. I mean, when you look at the retail investment market, which I'm less exposed to, but talking to some of the major consultants and brokers who do track the retail investment side of it, yes, there are a few transactions taking place in terms of shopping centers being bought or sold. But at the same time, you're starting to see, because of the point I mentioned at the beginning, where footfall is not always necessarily increasing at a steady rate, but you do see the baskets, the purchasing of a higher volume. So, which also means maybe I'll go less to the mall, but I will buy more when I go, partly because of the cost of living crisis. So you've got energy prices and so on. So why drive my car all the way there 3 times a week, when if I do 1 or 2 big shops, I may do one on a Saturday for my supermarket shopping, and then I'll do another for my retail shopping. So you're seeing the basket sizes being bigger. You're seeing rental values continuing to increase, or at least remain steady. Therefore, from a valuation point of view, it continues to be attractive as an asset class. But at the same time, not just shopping centers, but high streets. So you're seeing steady footfall, if not certain increasing footfall. You're seeing brands continue to trade well, and you're seeing the consumer back in these locations. So it's positive, but I still think we have to be very, very careful, because I deal a lot with retailers. Predominantly my work is around helping retailers and brands expand or grow or exit markets if it's not going well, but more importantly today, reassess their portfolio. So I have the privilege, if one calls it that, of going and renegotiating terms and conditions with landlords. So it really puts me at the coalface, so I can see through the eyes of these brands. Look, you can't tell me last year, 3 years ago, yes, we were trading at 100%. Now we're trading at 80%, but you're asking me for increased rent, and the footfall hasn't increased. So there's a disconnect there, which needs to be handled. So the market is still dynamic, but the market is still very challenged depending on where you are. And I should perhaps put the caveat that certain streets across Europe, even prime streets, are struggling to find their position again as it was pre-2020, 2019. So yes, I'm optimistic about retail across Europe. Otherwise, I wouldn't have much to do, would I?
Right, absolutely. How much of that do you think is going to be dependent upon tourism? I mean, in certain places, obviously, tourism is a very key driver of retail sales. But then again, it may be only a very small percent nationwide. How are you seeing that?
Well, I think one has to break down tourism as international tourism and national tourism. And one thing in particular, going back to the outlets, for example, the outlets very much focused, and I think this is a good not only example, but also an awareness for us. The outlets in particular were starting to look at, okay, our international clients, the tourists, are no longer here. How can we cater to the clients within the country and within a certain geography, whether it's, as usual, 90 to 190 minutes to 120 minutes, an hour and a half or so travel time, who are in your sector, and how do you then market to them to bring them into your center because they were not aware of it before. So the sort of domestic tourism has been strong and growing stronger in Europe generally, and I think certain locations and cities have got used to having people coming from other cities within that particular country. So that's something to focus on going forward. So, but then to your question, I guess more focused on international tourism. I think it depends on the city. Not all cities attract the same level of tourists as one might think. So yes, maybe, or certainly a London, a Paris, a Milan, maybe a Rome, an Amsterdam. So those major international cities would attract more tourism and would be happy with it. But then again, you've got to look at what kind of tourism. So when I walk around Paris, for example, I hear a lot of South Americans, I hear a lot of Italians, Germans, Americans, Brits, of course. The Asians are not back in full swing yet, in particular. Yes, they contribute, but I think many retailers and brands have learned, and you see them through the hotel nights as well. So the number of hotel nights that are taken up, it's a slow recovery process for tourism to get back where it was. I don't think it should be overestimated as to what it contributes.
We do tend to look at it as if tourism is really the key driver. And as you point out, it is, but only within certain areas, not as big on a nationwide basis. So I'm very glad you brought that up and clarified that for us. Part of being able to expand into these international markets is also being able to build a team of people. So you need to know the market, of course, as you're saying, in order to bring your brand in, but you also have to be able to have your home team, so to speak, working with your team in whatever market you're entering in. Now, I know you've talked extensively in your book, Breaking Down Barriers, about being able to build strong teams. What can you share from the point of view of people doing international retail with regard to this?
That's a really important point, Jane, that you raised there. Have in many cases chosen to do is to have their own team and interact less or not at all with the local community, the local market, to help them build their brand. It is so important to bring the knowledge and insight of the brand to the market, but then have local staffing. And it could be as simple, I'm not just talking about the store itself, but if you have a brand and you're bringing that brand into a new market with your architect, for example, have a local architect involved as well. Now, generally speaking, this is required by certain countries where it's the local architect that actually has to put the stamp and sign it. That's an easy sell, as it were. That's obvious. But if you bring your construction team in, for example, and I've seen this done where brands will bring their own construction team from the US, from the UK, from Germany. Yes, but then they've got to work with people on the ground. There's a language aspect, but there's more importantly a way in which, how do we take what you're trying to say to us and do, because you're not going to do just one store, presumably, you're going to do several. So there's got to be a point where there's transfer of knowledge and insight. And the earlier you start, the better, because the point about teams is once, yes, there's friction. Yes, there's challenge. Yes, like I say, there's this ego thing about I'm the protector of the brand and therefore I will do it the way I see it. But once you communicate and you help create a dialogue, then the project is much smoother because there will always be things that go wrong. When they go wrong, how are you going to deal with it and who is on the ground to deal with it with you? And that is as much the architectural team, the design team, the procurement team, right down to the legal team. So who are your lawyers on the ground? If you come in, and I've seen this time and time again, there's a corporate lawyer that works for the brand based in their home country, and they're imposing things on the way a lease structure should be created without taking advice from a local lawyer or having them involved in it to help. Even if they have offices here, I have on many occasions challenged even local offices here because I believe that they are creating that once in a million chances of something going wrong, and it will never happen. And if you go down that route, it either ends up being a deal breaker or everybody is incredibly frustrated and the deal never gets done anyway. So there's got to be a sense of kind of a common sense check that takes place. So teams are very important. Also, of course, when you get to the store, inevitably, you've got to have people in the store. Yes, you could have a general manager, a VP that is an expat, as we back in the old days, who would be working with you on the ground, but start to train individuals that one day they can grow up through the ranks and be successful.
I think that's such good advice. And, you can understand why people want to bring their own team, especially when they're coming into a new market. They feel unsure. They don't know the people. There's a lot of insecurity, so to speak. But I think, as you're pointing out, you do need people on the ground who understand the way things go around here, so to speak, right? and can bridge that gap. Now, Chris, you've shared so many interesting things, and I think a lot of people would like to be able to reach out to you. They probably have their own questions. And of course, I think a lot of people would love to get your book, Breaking Down Barriers. How can people find you? How can they connect with you?
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Jane. I am on social media, so if they are on LinkedIn, I'm very active on LinkedIn. I post a lot, although some people have told me I don't post enough because they enjoy what I post. I try and create variety in what I do. So LinkedIn is one way. I'm also on Instagram. Otherwise, they can also email me at contact@igweinternational.com, all one word, contact@igweinternational.com. But they can also go to my website, which is igweinternational.com, igweinternational.com. And find me there. So, and also in terms of the book, it's on Amazon. So thanks for raising that. It's recently been launched, so I'm very excited. I'm getting people sending me pictures of where they bought it and how it's. I think I'm going to do a competition to see who has the best photos of my book in some location. But it's on Amazon, so it can be obtained there.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to put all of those links in the show notes, and I would certainly encourage anybody who is considering entering the European market to reach out to Chris. He's a wealth of information, and sometimes just getting the right advice can save you a tremendous amount of pain and also enable you to succeed in markets where there's opportunities, but you need to know what you're doing in order to be able to realize them. So thank you, Chris, for coming on A Seat at the Table. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Jane. I do appreciate you inviting me on. It's been fantastic to share with you. All the very best.